Luca Moretti believed every human being had a price. He had spent 20 years proving it, buying judges, buying silence, buying loyalty, buying the kind of obedience most men mistake for love. Then he walked into a dying dry cleaning shop at midnight with blood on his sleeve and offered a broke, exhausted woman $10,000 to forget his face. She refused it in less than 30 seconds. That single refusal would cost her nothing and change everything. It would also be the first of 3. And by the 3rd, the most dangerous man in the city would understand something money had never taught him. The rain came down in cold sheets that October night, the kind that turns streetlights into smeared halos and makes every sound feel closer than it is. Carter Garment Restoration sat on the corner of a block that had seen better decades, a narrow storefront squeezed between a shuttered locksmith and a check-cashing place with bars on the windows. The neon open sign buzzed in the window, one letter flickering with a dying transformer, casting a sick red pulse across wet pavement. Inside, Elena Carter was closing out a 14-hour day. Her hands smelled of perchloroethylene and hot starch. Her lower back ached in the specific way that came from standing at a steam press since 6 that morning. She had 11 claim tickets left on the rack, $412 in the register, and a stack of unpaid invoices in a drawer that she had stopped opening because looking at them didn't make them smaller. She reached for the switch beneath the counter, the one that killed the neon sign and told the street the shop was done, pretending to be open. The bell above the door rang first. Elena didn't look up right away. "We're closed, I'm sorry, I was just..." Then she saw him. He filled the doorway the way certain men do, not because of size, though he was tall, but because of stillness. He didn't shake off the rain. He didn't apologize for the hour. He simply stood there, water running off broad shoulders, wrapped in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to trust. His face was calm, controlled, dark eyes that gave away nothing. His right sleeve was soaked through with blood, not his own. She could tell that immediately. The angle was wrong, the spray pattern wrong, no wound visible on the hand that hung at his side. Whoever had bled onto that $2,000 wool had done so violently and recently. "Can you save it?" His voice was low, quiet, the kind of quiet that made you lean in rather than ask him to repeat himself. Elena's pulse ticked up, but her hand stayed steady. 14 years in this shop had taught her that panic never got a stain out of anything. "Take it off," she said. He did, without hesitation, folding it once and laying it across the laminate counter like he was handing over something fragile instead of evidence. She pulled on a pair of thin cotton gloves from beneath the counter and examined the fabric under the fluorescent light. Super 150s wool, hand-finished seams, the kind of tailoring you don't find on a rack. "Blood sets fast in a weave this fine," she said, mostly to herself, running a finger along the stain's edge. "If it had dried another hour, I'd tell you to frame it instead. Proteins bind to natural fibers almost immediately. I'll need cold water first, never hot. Heat cooks the protein right into the thread, then an enzyme pre-treatment, cold soak, and a hand press. No machine near this collar." She looked up. "It'll take 3 days, maybe 4 if the color needs resetting." She did not ask whose blood it was. He noticed that she didn't ask. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a thick envelope and set it on the counter beside the jacket. It landed with a soft, heavy sound, the sound only large amounts of cash can make. "That covers the cleaning," he said, "and your memory. You didn't see me tonight. You don't know my name. You clean clothes. That's all you do." Elena looked at the envelope. $10,000, easily. Maybe more. She thought about the boiler in the basement that groaned like a dying animal every time it kicked on. She thought about the landlord's letter taped to her cash drawer, the one with the red stamp on it. She thought about her mother's hip replacement, still not fully paid off 2 years later. She thought about sleep, real sleep, the kind you get when you're not doing math in your head at 3 in the morning. $10,000 could fix almost all of it. She pushed it back across the counter. "That's too much," she said. He studied her the way he might study a column of numbers that didn't add up. "Is it not enough?" "It's too much," she repeated. "Way too much for a jacket, and way too much for silence, because I don't sell that either." She reached beneath the counter, tore a claim ticket off the pad, and stamped it. Yellow paper, black ink, a torn perforated edge. "This is a dry cleaner. I charge $45 for a jacket like this, $60 if the stain's stubborn. You'll get a receipt, you'll get a ticket. You come back Thursday and pick it up like everybody else." Luca didn't move. "You understand what I am," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have a pretty good guess," Elena said. I also understand what I am. I'm not your employee. I'm not your alibi. I'm not scared enough to take your money. And I'm not stupid enough to think that money doesn't come with a leash attached. She met his eyes for the first time since he'd walked in and didn't look away. If I take that envelope, I work for you. I don't work for you. I clean your jacket. That's the whole transaction. For a long moment, the only sound in the shop was the hiss of the idle steam press and the rain hammering the front glass. Then Luca reached into his pocket, produced $60 in cash, and set it on the counter. Nothing more, nothing less. Elena rang it up. The register drawer clattered open with its familiar rattle. She counted out his change, $3.15, and held it out. He didn't take it. Keep it. She set it on the counter instead, coins stacked with the bills folded neatly beneath them, and slid it toward him with one finger. I don't take tips I didn't earn, she said. Come back Thursday. Bring your ticket. Luca Moretti had walked out of that shop with nothing but a scrap of yellow paper and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, absolutely no idea what to say. He put the claim ticket in his coat pocket. He did not throw it away. Behind the counter, Elena watched the door swing shut, listened to the bell settle, and then hung the ruined, blood-stained jacket on the processing rack among a dozen other people's secrets. Her hands were steady. It wasn't until she'd locked the front door, killed the buzzing neon sign, and sat alone in the dark for a full minute that they finally started to shake. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself a lot of things that week. Money doesn't ask permission before it changes the shape of a life. It just arrives quietly, dressed as help. 4 days later, the boiler in the basement of Carter Garment Restoration made a sound like a dying engine and stopped working entirely. Elena stood on the cracked concrete steps in the sub-basement at 7 in the morning, flashlight in her teeth, staring at a pilot assembly that had corroded into uselessness sometime around the Clinton administration. The repairman's quote was $4,200. Elena's business account held $611. Without hot water and steam pressure, Carter Garment Restoration could not restore garments. It could barely function as a laundromat. She was still doing the math. Could she push the boiler another week? Could she borrow from her already maxed line of credit? Could she call her cousin in Scranton who owed her a favor? When a black Mercedes with tinted windows pulled up outside and idled at the curb like it belonged there, the man who stepped out wore a charcoal suit with the easy confidence of someone who'd never once worried about a landlord letter. He smiled before he even reached the door, the kind of professional warmth that made Elena's guard go up immediately. "Miss Muse Carter," he said, extending a hand. "Marco Bellini. I work with Mr. Moretti." She didn't shake it. "I figured." Marco's smile didn't falter. He set a leather folio on the counter and opened it to reveal a cashier's check, crisp and official, made out to Carter Garment Restoration. $50,000. "Mr. Moretti recently acquired this building," Marco said pleasantly. "As your new landlord, he's aware of some infrastructure concerns, the boiler specifically. He'd like to make an investment in the property. No strings. Consider it a gesture of goodwill between a landlord and a valued tenant." Elena stared at the check for a long moment. Then she looked up. "He bought my building 3 days ago," Marco confirmed. "After he came in here." "I couldn't say when Mr. Moretti makes his decisions," Marco said, which was its own kind of answer. Elena closed the folio without touching the check. "Tell him I said no." "Mrs. Carter, this isn't." "Tell him I said no," she repeated, and this time there was iron in it. "And tell him I know exactly where to find him." She did not wait for Marco to leave. She grabbed her coat off the hook, shoved the folio under her arm, and walked 11 blocks in 20-degree wind to a building she'd never set foot inside. The kind of place with a discreet awning and no sign, where the doorman knew every face that was supposed to walk through and every face that wasn't. She was not supposed to walk through. She walked through anyway. The inside of Luca's supper club felt like stepping into a different decade. Dark wood paneling, low golden light, the murmur of a jazz trio in the corner, leather booths occupied by men who did not look up from their drinks so much as they clocked every person who entered and filed them into categories. Threat. No threat. Threat. 2 men in dark suits moved toward Elena before she'd taken 5 steps. She didn't stop walking. "I need to speak with Luca Moretti." "Ma'am, you can't." She spotted him in the back booth, alone, a glass of something amber untouched in front of him, and she walked straight past the men reaching for her arms. She slammed the folio down on his table hard enough that his glass jumped. The 2 guards lunged. Luca raised 2 fingers, barely an inch off the table. They stopped instantly, like marionettes with their strings cut. Elena flipped the folio open, jabbed a finger at the check. $50,000. A gesture, Lucas said calmly. A leash, she snapped. Dressed up nice so I wouldn't notice the collar. She leaned forward, both palms flat on the table, close enough now that she could see the faint scar through his left eyebrow, close enough to smell cedar and rain on his coat. I am not a charity case. I am not your project. I am not for sale, Mr. Moretti, and I am absolutely not something you can acquire along with a building. The jazz trio kept playing. Nobody in the club moved. I'll pay my rent, Elena said. On time, every month, at whatever rate is fair for the space, same as I would with any landlord who wasn't secretly running half this city. But if another envelope, another check, another gesture shows up at my counter, I will close Carter Garment Restoration, sell what's left of the equipment for scrap, and leave this city so fast you'll need Marco Bellini just to find out which state I'm in. Lucas said nothing for a long moment. He studied her the way he'd studied the jacket 4 nights earlier, carefully, as if trying to identify a fabric he didn't recognize. You would burn down your own life, he said slowly, rather than owe me anything. Every time, Elena said. That's not a threat, that's a promise. She picked up the folio, tucked it under her arm, and walked back out through the club without a single guard moving to stop her. Lucas sat alone in the booth for a long time after the door closed behind her. He had spent 2 decades learning exactly what made people move: fear, want, debt, ambition. He had never once met someone who would rather lose everything than be owned by any of it. He did not sleep well that night. For the first time since he was a young man clawing his way up through a violent, unforgiving business, Luca Moretti was curious about someone in a way that had nothing to do with what she could do for him. That curiosity, he would later understand, was the first crack in a wall he hadn't known he'd built. A week passed. The city got colder. The shop got colder too. The boiler still limped along on a temporary fix that cost Elena $400 she didn't have, hissing and groaning through every cycle like it resented being alive. She was hunched over the ledger at the counter, breath faintly visible in the chill when the bell above the door rang. Luca stood there in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, no suit, no entourage, no blood. He looked for a moment almost like an ordinary man. He carried a plain plastic grocery bag. You're not wearing a $3,000 suit, Elena said, setting down her pen. It's laundry day, he said, and something in his tone might have been dry humor, if she'd let herself believe it. He set the bag on the counter. Inside was a cashmere sweater, pale gray, with a coffee stains spreading across the chest in a shape too perfectly centered to be an accident. Elena picked it up, turned it over once, and looked at him flatly. This is the most deliberate coffee stain I've ever seen in my life. My household staff can't get it out. Your household staff didn't spill this, she said. You did, on purpose. This morning, probably, right before you drove over here. He didn't confirm it. He also didn't deny it. She rang up the ticket, $19 for a cashmere sweater, and he paid in exact cash, no tip, no envelope, no gesture. He remembered the rule. That more than anything unsettled her. He didn't leave right away. He stood at the counter while she filled out the ticket, watching the steam press hiss in the back, watching her hands move with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Your bank loan, he said, conversational. The one on the equipment, 4.2%, 26 months remaining. Elena's pen stopped moving. How do you know that? I own a controlling interest in the bank. She set the pen down very slowly. You're cornering me. I'm not. You bought my building. You know my interest rate down to the decimal. You sent $50,000 disguised as a landlord's gift. You are systematically surrounding my entire financial life, Luca, and you're doing it so quietly you probably think it doesn't count as pressure. Her voice cracked with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, something closer to exhaustion. What do you want from me? The question hung in the cold air between them. Luca opened his mouth to answer, the way he always answered, instantly, because in his world hesitation got people killed, and found, for possibly the first time in his adult life, that he had no answer ready. I don't know, he said. It came out quieter than anything else he'd said to her, almost startled at itself. Elena stared at him, a man who ran half the criminal infrastructure of a major American city, standing in her freezing dry cleaning shop, admitting he didn't know what he wanted. I won't let you drown, he added low. The boiler, the loan, the rent. I won't let it take you under. I don't want your help. I know, Luca said. That's exactly why I trust you. He left before she could answer, the bell ringing once behind him, And Elena stood at the counter for a long time afterwards, staring at $19 in exact cash sitting in her register, understanding with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that the visit had never really been about the sweater at all. He came back Friday to collect it, as promised, and walked into chaos. A heavy-set man in an expensive but poorly maintained overcoat was leaning across the counter, jabbing a finger toward Elena's face, his voice pitched loud enough to rattle the window glass. "You ruined it! $600. That shirt, and you people melted the collar." "Sir," Elena said, calm as still water, already pulling a folder from beneath the counter, "this is a polyester blend shirt from a fast fashion retailer. It retails for $34. I have photographs from intake showing scorch damage consistent with a home iron set too hot for synthetic fiber, dated 2 days before you brought it to me." She slid the folder toward him. "I didn't touch an iron near this shirt. You did." "That's a lie. It's a time stamp," Elena said. "Cameras don't lie, even if customers do." The man's face reddened. He leaned further over the counter, voice rising into something uglier. "You think you can talk to me like—" The bell rang. Luca stepped inside and said nothing at all. He didn't need to. He simply looked at the man, a long, flat, unhurried look, the kind that had once made hardened men empty their bladders in fear, and the customer's voice died somewhere in his throat. He straightened up, muttered something that might have been an apology to no one in particular, and left so quickly he didn't bother taking his ruined shirt. The bell rang again behind him. Silence settled over the shop. "I had that handled," Elena said, arms crossed. "I know. Then why?" "I didn't do it for you," Luca said. "I did it because I don't like watching people raise their voice at things they don't understand." A pause. "You had the paperwork. You would have won. That's not the point." "I know that too," he said, and set 2 paper cups on the counter. Black coffee, 2 sugars in one, plain in the other. "I asked the girl at the coffee shop what you drink. She said you're particular about it." Elena took the cup, mostly out of surprise, and held it without drinking. "You scared off a paying customer, Luca." That was a jerk with a fake claim, sure, but the next time somebody sees a man like you walk in here and clear a room with a look, they're going to start whispering that Carter Garment Restoration is protected. And once people believe that, ordinary customers stop coming in. Nobody wants their church clothes cleaned at the mob-adjacent dry cleaner. Luca considered this with more seriousness than she expected. "I'm used to fixing things by breaking something else," he admitted. "It's the only method I've ever needed." "Well, it's not going to work in here," Elena said, though her voice had softened slightly around the edges. "I'm trying to learn a different one." She took a sip of the coffee. It was, infuriatingly, exactly how she liked it. That became the rhythm over the weeks that followed, though neither of them called it a rhythm out loud. Tuesdays, Luca dropped off some item of clothing that rarely needed the attention he claimed it did. Fridays, he came to collect it, coffee in hand, and stayed exactly as long as the transaction technically required, and then a little longer than that. He always paid exact change. He asked, every Friday without fail, about the boiler. She complained every Friday without fail about the price of enzyme pretreatment solvent. One Tuesday he brought in a silk tie with a stain so faint Elena had to hold it up to the light twice before she found it at all. A single droplet, maybe wine, maybe nothing. "This doesn't need cleaning," she said. "This needs a magnifying glass to even see it. Better safe. You're running out of clothes to ruin, Luca. I have a large wardrobe. You have an expensive hobby," she said. But she took the tie anyway, wrote up a ticket, charged him $12, and didn't ask why a man who owned half the city's real estate cared so much about a stain the size of a pinhead. Another Friday, he arrived 15 minutes before closing to find her wrestling a jammed feed mechanism on the smaller of her 2 presses, knuckles scraped, hair falling loose from its clip, muttering something uncharitable about the manufacturer's customer service line. "Let me look," he said. "You know how to fix a garment press?" "No," he admitted, "but I know how to hold a flashlight and hand you tools without being asked, which I understand is most of what's required." She laughed, a short, surprised sound she hadn't planned on, and handed him the flashlight. He held it steady for 20 minutes while she worked the jam loose, and neither of them said much of anything, and it was, without either of them naming it, one of the better evenings either of them had had in longer than they wanted to admit. Neither of them mentioned that they'd started arranging their weeks around it. But the shop's other regulars noticed. The mail carrier joked once that the quiet, well-dressed man was becoming part of the furniture. Elena laughed it off and changed the subject, and later that night found herself smiling about it, while she balanced a ledger that, for the first time in over a year, actually balanced. December arrived hard and gray, sleet needling sideways against the shop's front window, the kind of weather that kept ordinary customers home and left Elena alone behind the counter finishing invoices by the register light. The bell rang at 6:30. 2 men walked in. Elena knew immediately they weren't customers, not from their clothes, not from anything they carried, but from the way they moved through the space like they already owned it. One had a tattoo climbing up the side of his neck, a stylized black crow half hidden by a popped collar. "Cozy little place," the tattooed one said, glancing around with theatrical interest. "We're closing," Elena said evenly, her hand drifting toward the drawer beneath the counter where the heavy tailor shears sat, cold and familiar. The second man reached out almost casually and knocked over a full quart of pressing solvent. It hit the ledger on the counter in a dark spreading wash, ruining a week of handwritten entries in seconds. Then he shoved the nearest garment rack, and a dozen freshly pressed, clear-bagged customer garments slid off their hangers onto the wet, dirty linoleum floor. "Oops," he said. "Get out," Elena said, and her voice didn't shake, though every muscle in her body had gone rigid. The tattooed man leaned across the counter, close enough that she could smell cigarette smoke on his coat. "We hear Moretti's been coming around. Real friendly with the help." His grin was all teeth. "You tell your boyfriend that Carter Garment Restoration is a real nice little building. Real flammable, too. Buildings like this. Old wiring, cheap paint, things happen. Real shame if a fire started," the second man added. "With you in it." They left the way they'd come, unhurried, laughing quietly to each other as the bell rang behind them. Elena stood behind the counter and did not move for almost a full minute. Then she sank onto the stool, and her hands, steady through 14-hour shifts, steady through burns and needles and slammed doors, began to shake so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs to stop them. She was angry at the 2 men. She discovered, sitting there in the ruined quiet of her own shop, that she was also angry at Luca. His world had just walked through her door and put its hands on her livelihood, and she hadn't invited it in. He arrived the next morning and knew before he'd crossed the threshold that something was wrong. The garment rack stood bent at an angle it shouldn't have. The ledger on the counter had dried into a warped, discolored ruin. Elena moved slower than usual, the fatigue in her shoulders sitting differently than ordinary exhaustion. The ordinary man who brought coffee and complained about detergent prices disappeared. In his place stood the version of Luca Moretti that the city whispered about and never said out loud. "Who?" he said. One word. Flat and cold as the sleet outside. Elena hesitated, then described them. The crow tattoo, the popped collar, the casual cruelty in the way they'd knocked the rack sideways just to watch things fall. "Did they touch you?" Luca said. Not a question. A demand for information he needed immediately. "No." Something in his shoulders eased fractionally, though his eyes stayed dark. "They're dead men." "No," Elena said, and stepped around the counter to stand directly in front of him, closer than she usually let herself get. "Listen to me. If you kill them over me, you're telling every rival organization in this city that I matter to you. That makes me a target worth using, worth taking, worth threatening again just to see what you'll do. I am a civilian, Luca. I want to stay one. Killing 2 idiots doesn't make me safer. It makes me a lever. So I do nothing." "I didn't say that." She held his gaze. "I said stay away from me until you figure out how to handle this without turning me into a headline." Something crossed his face then. Not anger, but a kind of exposed rawness she hadn't seen from him before. "I tried that," he admitted. "Staying away. I lasted 4 days before I poured coffee on a $200 sweater just to have a reason to walk back in here." The confession sat between them, unguarded and strange coming from a man who guarded everything. "I'll fix this," Luca said. "No blood. I give you my word." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing a promise from a man whose entire life had been built on the opposite of restraint. Slowly, he extended his hand across the counter, palm open, upward, fingers loose. He didn't reach for her. He didn't close the distance himself. He waited. Elena looked at that open hand for 3 full seconds. Then she placed hers into it. His fingers closed around hers, gentle in a way that felt almost foreign to a hand she'd once watched arrive covered in someone else's blood. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Marco Bellini did not understand the order, and he said so plainly, standing in Luca's office with its floor-to-soiling windows overlooking a gray winter skyline. 2 guys walk into her shop, threaten to burn it down with her inside, and we're not putting them in the river? "No," Luca said. not looking up from the file open on his desk. That's going to look weak, Luca. Word gets around that somebody can threaten your girl and walk away breathing. Every two-bit crew in 3 boroughs is going to test it. I gave her my word, Luca said. No blood. Marco stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Since when does Luca Moretti keep promises to civilians? Since now, Luca said, and finally looked up. Sit down. I'm going to explain how we do this instead. He laid it out over the next 40 minutes with the same cold precision he applied to everything. The rival organization behind the 2 men ran its money through a network of shell trucking companies, waste management contracts, and a handful of union pension funds that nobody looked at too closely. Luca had spent 15 years quietly accumulating pieces of exactly that kind of infrastructure. Regulators who owed him favors, bank officers who processed his loans, city contract officials who valued their continued employment. Over the following 6 weeks, without a single gunshot, the rival boss's trucking permits were suspended pending a safety audit that never seemed to conclude. His waste contracts were quietly reassigned after an anonymous tip about billing irregularities. 3 banks called in loans simultaneously, a coincidence so precise it could not have been one. A union local suddenly discovered discrepancies in its pension fund that triggered a federal inquiry. Violence creates noise, Luca had told Marco, and noise brings police, and police brings scrutiny nobody in this business can afford. Silence is a weapon too. It just takes longer to swing. Within 2 months, the rival organization had bled out financially in a way that no amount of muscle could have prevented. Luca absorbed the territory the way water fills a space where pressure has been removed. Quietly, completely, without a single funeral. The tattooed man came to Carter Garment Restoration on a Tuesday in late January, standing outside on the sidewalk rather than crossing the threshold. As though an invisible line existed at the door he did not dare step over. Mrs. Carter, he said, and his voice had none of its earlier swagger. I want to apologize for before. Elena crossed her arms and said nothing. Moretti owns our whole operation now, the man continued. First thing he told everybody, before anything else, this shop is untouchable. Nobody comes near it, nobody near you. Not for money, not for a message, not for nothing. He set an envelope on the sidewalk just outside her door, careful not to step past it. That's from me, my own money, not his. He left before she could respond. Elena picked up the envelope and stood in the cold for a long moment, understanding with a strange, unsteady feeling that Luca had kept his promise exactly. No bodies, no sirens, no blood on anyone's hands. He had changed the instinct of a lifetime, quietly, without telling her, because she had asked him to. He came in on a Friday evening in February with no clothes to collect and no coffee to deliver, and Elena raised an eyebrow at him from behind the counter. You're going to bankrupt me at this rate, she said, coming in here with nothing to launder. What am I supposed to charge you for? Emotional support? Have dinner with me, Luca said. Elena blinked. Excuse me? Not the club, not your neighborhood, somewhere neither of us has ever been. A pause, something almost hesitant in it. As civilians. She studied him for a long moment, the man who owned banks and buildings and half the criminal infrastructure north of the river, standing in her shop, asking a simple question like it cost him something to ask it. Fine, she said, but you're paying full price and I'm not wearing anything nice, 'cause I don't own anything nice, and I refuse to feel underdressed in my own life. He picked her up in a restored 1969 muscle car, dark green, engine growling low, the interior smelling faintly of leather and gasoline instead of cedar and rain. They drove 40 minutes outside the city to a small, family-run Italian restaurant with checkered tablecloths and a grandmother working the kitchen, who came out personally to ask if everything was to their liking. For 20 minutes, conversation stayed determinedly ordinary. The weather, the traffic on the interstate, whether the veal or the branzino was better, a debate the waiter eventually settled by bringing them both. You drive like a man who's never gotten a ticket in his life, Elena said, sipping her wine. I've never gotten a ticket in my life. Of course you haven't. It's not what you think, Luca said, almost amused. I just drive carefully. Old habit. A man in my position can't afford to be memorable to the wrong kind of police officer. So you're telling me the terrifying crime boss obeys the speed limit, religiously. Elena laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she didn't often let herself have. And for a moment, the checkered tablecloth and the smell of garlic, and the grandmother humming to herself in the kitchen, made the whole evening feel almost dangerously normal, like 2 ordinary people on a date instead of a man who fixed problems with fear and a woman who fixed problems with steam and patience. Then Luca set down his fork. "Why did you refuse the 50,000? He said, not accusing, genuinely asking. Elena was quiet for a moment, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. "My father owned a hardware store," she said finally. 30 years, same block, same customers, same bell over the door. When the big chain opened 2 miles away, business started dying slow. He needed capital to survive the first 2 years. A bank wouldn't touch him. So he took a loan from a man in this city who didn't ask for collateral, just interest. She looked up. The interest doubled every missed payment. Within a year, he owed 4 times what he'd borrowed. He sold everything. The truck, my mother's jewelry, eventually the house I grew up in, trying to keep pace with numbers that kept moving faster than he could run. He worked himself into the ground trying to save something that was already gone. He had a heart attack behind the counter of a store he no longer technically owned on a Tuesday afternoon, restocking a shelf of nails nobody would ever buy. Luca said nothing. He didn't reach for platitudes. "The lender came to the funeral," Elena said, voice steady but distant, like she was reading it off a page she'd memorized a long time ago. "Stood in the back in an expensive coat and announced right there, in front of my mother, that the debt was forgiven, like it was a gift, like the 11 years it had taken to kill my father were just the cost of doing business, and now that my father was dead, the account was finally settled." She met his eyes. "I was 19. I swore I would never let a powerful man's money into my life again, no matter how good it looked on the surface, because I watched exactly what it does underneath." The restaurant noise faded around them. "Your money never looked like rescue to me, Luca," she said quietly. "It looked like a collar. Every single time." Luca sat very still. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. Trying to save you with money was." He stopped, searching for the word with the same care he'd once reserved for negotiating a life or death deal. "It was an insult. I see that now. I've spent my whole life believing money solves what fear can't, and fear solves what violence can't. And somewhere in there, I forgot that some things were never for sale to begin with." He reached across the table and took her hand, not gripping it, not pulling it toward him, simply holding it, the way she'd held his in the shop weeks earlier. "I see you now," he said. "Not the shop, not the problem I wanted to fix. You." Elena didn't pull away. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the particular, heavy silence of a wall finally coming down between two people who had both spent years building walls for good reason. Neither of them said anything else for a long time. They didn't need to. Winter softened into something colder still, and somewhere in the middle of it, without either of them announcing it out loud, Carter Garment Restoration became a place where Luca Moretti simply existed rather than visited. He came by most evenings now, not always with laundry, sometimes just to sit on the stool behind the counter with a folder of financial reports balanced on his knee, while Elena worked the last press cycle of the day. The steam hissed. The garment racks rattled softly on their casters. The old boiler, finally repaired at Elena's own expense over several careful months, ran quiet and warm beneath the floor. He never conducted business inside the shop. Not once. Marco learned quickly to text rather than call while Luca was there, and to keep his visits brief and outside on the sidewalk. Elena never asked about the occasional bruised knuckles, the faint tension in his jaw some evenings that told her something had happened somewhere she wasn't invited into. She understood the boundary the same way he understood hers. Some doors stayed shut so the whole house could stay standing. It was, in its strange and unlikely way, ordinary. A man reading reports. A woman pressing collars. Coffee going cold in paper cups. The bell over the door ringing for actual customers who had no idea the quiet man in the corner controlled half the city they lived in. One evening, an elderly customer, Mrs. Okafor, mistook Luca for the shop's newest employee and asked him, quite sincerely, to help carry a box of donated coats to her car. Elena watched, biting back a smile, as the most feared man in the city hefted a cardboard box full of secondhand parkas out to a 15-year-old Buick without a single word of protest, and came back inside afterward looking faintly, privately pleased with himself. "You're very good at that," Elena said. "At carrying boxes? At being ordinary. It suits you more than you'd think." He considered that for a moment, the way he considered most things, slowly, like a man checking for a hidden cost. "It's the only version of myself I've never had to defend," he said finally, and went back to his folder of reports, as though he hadn't just said something that quietly rearranged something in her chest. They fell into small, unglamorous rituals neither of them announced. He learned which claim tickets belonged to regulars who couldn't afford to pay full price and quietly adjusted nothing about their bills. because Elena had made clear, once sharply, that charity dressed as a discount was still charity, and she decided who got one, not him. He learned to sit on the low stool by the window instead of the good chair, because the good chair she had a wobble Elena liked to use as an excuse to make people stay a little longer while she fixed it. She learned that he took his coffee black most days and sweet only on the days he didn't sleep, and stopped asking which kind he wanted, and started just making the decision for him, which he never once argued with. It felt for a while like something close to peace, but the narrator must be honest here, the way any good storyteller must be honest with an audience they respect. Peace in Luca Moretti's world was never permanent. It was only ever a pause between one danger and the next one was already walking toward them through the dark. The ambush came on a Thursday night in early March, the air still holding winter's teeth even as the calendar promised spring. Luca walked Elena the 2 blocks from the shop to where she'd parked her car, a habit that had become as unremarkable to both of them as the coffee cups and the yellow claim tickets. The street was empty, streetlights buzzing overhead, ice crusted thin along the curb. 3 men stepped out of the alley between a shuttered bakery and a boarded storefront. They moved differently than the 2 amateurs who'd wrecked Elena's ledger back in December. No swagger, no theater, just the economical, disciplined movement of professionals who did this for a living and expected to be paid regardless of outcome. Contractors, out-of-toners. The kind of men Luca's disrupted supply chains had made very, very angry. "Behind me," Luca said, and the word came out flat, absolute, already moving even as he said it. Elena's back hit the brick wall of the alley entrance. She didn't argue. One of the men reached inside his coat. Luca closed the distance before the gun cleared the fabric. What happened next took less time to occur than it takes to describe it. Luca's forearm snapped across the first man's wrist at an angle that produced a sound like a dry branch breaking, and the gun spun free across the ice, skittering into the dark. The second man lunged and caught a rigid strike to the throat that dropped him gagging to his knees before his hands even finished forming fists. The third swung wide and sloppy with fear rising in his eyes, and Luca's legs swept his feet out from under him while a short, brutal elbow caught his ribs on the way down, a crack audible even over the wind. 15 seconds, maybe less. 3 trained men on the ground, disarmed, broken, gasping against frozen concrete. Luca stood in the middle of the street breathing hard, knuckles split open and bleeding freely in the cold, dark eyes still lit with the particular fire of a man who has just, without hesitation, done exactly what he was built for. This was the man the whole city feared. Elena was seeing him now, unfiltered, in real time, and she understood there was no metaphor left standing between them. No suit, no coffee, no ordinary Tuesday. This was Luca Moretti with nothing softened. He turned to her, chest heaving, waiting, she realized later, for her to run. Elena looked at his hands. "You're bleeding," she said. Not fear, not horror. Simple, practical observation, the same tone she used when a customer's silk blouse came in with a tear she needed to assess. She crossed the frozen sidewalk, took his torn wrist gently in both hands, and turned it toward the streetlight to check the damage. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you cleaned up before you drip on the upholstery." She led him back toward the shop, and Luca, a man who had just disabled 3 armed contractors without breaking stride, found himself utterly disarmed by 6 words and the steady grip of a woman's hands on his wrist. The back room of Carter Garment Restoration smelled of hot starch and antiseptic under harsh fluorescent light. Elena sat Luca on an overturned crate near the pressing station, laid out cotton gauze, a bottle of peroxide, and a small tin of butterfly closures she kept for exactly this kind of emergency, though she'd never once expected to use it on a man like him. She worked in silence at first, cleaning the split skin across his knuckles with careful, professional hands, the same hands that treated bloodstains and burn marks and years of other people's damage every single day. "You should be at a hospital," she said. "Hospitals ask questions. So do I." He almost smiled at that. Almost. But as the adrenaline drained out of him, something darker moved in behind it. Guilt, sharp and sudden, crawling up his spine as he watched her dab peroxide across his bleeding hands. "They were there for me," he said quietly. "You were standing 4 feet away, if I'd been half a second slower. But you weren't. Next time I might be." Elena set the gauze down and looked at him directly. "Luca, I need you gone," he said, and the words came out fast, clipped, panic, dressed up as certainty. He reached into his coat and produced a black card, then a folded document, a deed, she realized, to a property somewhere far from this city, already in her name. "There's a flight tonight. Private. Whatever city you want, I'll have a house ready by morning. A new shop, better equipment than you've ever had, fully staffed if you want it, or fully yours if you don't. Any amount you need, unlimited, no conditions. His voice was rising now, urgent, the old machinery of his life kicking back into gear the only way he knew how to protect anything. I need you gone by sunrise. Distance keeps you alive. I can't lose you to something that was aimed at me. Elena stood very still, staring at the card, the deed, the same tired script written in a new, more desperate hand. Then she pushed all of it back into his coat, hard enough that the deed crumpled against his chest. This is the third time, she said, voice shaking now with something closer to fury than fear. First you tried to buy my silence. Then you tried to buy my problems. Now you're trying to buy my disappearance. The answer is still no, Luca. It was no in October, and it's no now. You don't understand the danger you're. I watched you break 3 men's bones in under 15 seconds tonight, she snapped. I understand exactly what you are. I am not confused about the danger. I am telling you that running me out of my own life isn't protection. It's just another version of control wearing a nicer coat. Luca's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd known him, something in his composure genuinely cracked. Everything I touch becomes stained, he said, low and raw. My father, my men, every rival I've ever destroyed. If you stay, I drag you into that darkness whether I mean to or not, and I would rather lose you to distance than lose you to what I am. Elena picked the bloodied gauze back up, set it down deliberately, and looked at him with the calm, direct clarity of someone who had spent her entire adult life working with exactly the kind of damage he was describing. I clean stains for a living, Luca, she said. Blood, wine, scorch marks, chemical burns, things that would make most people throw the garment away. Do you know what I've learned doing this for 14 years? Damage doesn't make something worthless. It just means it needs the right hands and the right care instead of the trash bin. She stepped closer, close enough to hold his gaze without flinching. You are not ruined fabric. You are a man who has lived in the dark so long you've forgotten there's any other way to live. That's not the same thing as unsalvageable. Luca stared at her, breathing unsteady, hands still raw beneath her bandages. Stop trying to buy me, Elena said, quieter now but firmer than anything else she'd said all night. You cannot purchase your way into being loved, Luca. If you want me, earn me, every day, the way you have been without even realizing it, every Tuesday and every Friday since October. Something in him finally gave way. Not collapse, but surrender of a different kind. The release of a man who had spent his whole life gripping tightly onto control. Finally understanding, there was nothing left to grip in this particular moment except her. He reached for her, slow enough that she could have stopped him and didn't, and pulled her into an embrace that had nothing calculated in it at all. I cannot lose you, he said against her hair, voice cracking in a way she suspected no one alive had ever heard from him. I don't know how to do this without breaking something. I've never once had to. Then don't break anything, Elena murmured. Just stay. He pulled back just far enough to look at her, and then he kissed her, desperate, unhurried despite the urgency behind it. Careful in a way his bleeding hands weren't built for, like a man handling something he was terrified of damaging and unwilling to lose regardless. Elena kissed him back with the same fierce, earned certainty she'd carried since the night she'd pushed $10,000 back across her counter. And for a long moment, neither the criminal empire outside the door nor the debt-scared history behind her existed at all. There was only the hiss of the steam press cooling in the next room, the smell of antiseptic and cedar, and 2 people who had finally stopped trying to buy or barter their way into being understood. Elena Carter refused Luca Moretti's money 3 times. The first refusal made him curious about a woman who wanted nothing he could offer. The second made him obsessed with someone willing to burn her own life down rather than owe him anything. The third finally taught him the one lesson his entire empire had never been able to teach him. That some things simply cannot be purchased, no matter how much you're willing to spend. And love, real love, has to be earned in small, quiet, unglamorous moments. Exact change, kept promises, apologies offered without excuses, and a hand extended palm up instead of closed into a fist. Luca Moretti spent his whole life believing that money could buy obedience, fear could buy silence, and power could buy access. He was right about all 3. But Elena Carter's heart had no price tag on it at all. It had to be earned one Tuesday and one Friday at a time, until a dangerous man learned the one form of restraint his violent world had never required of him. He still kept that first yellow claim ticket, the one from the bloody suit that started it all, folded in the same coat pocket where he'd once carried $10,000, meant to buy her silence. He never needed to buy her silence again. She gave him something far more valuable, freely, the moment she decided he'd earned it. So tell me, do you think Elena was right to stay with a man like Luca, knowing exactly what he was capable of? Can a dangerous man really change, or does he just learn where to hide the parts of himself that haven't? And at what moment in this story did you first realize Luca had actually fallen in love with her? Was it the exact change, the coffee order, the promise of no blood, or the moment he finally asked instead of taking? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story pulled at something in you, hit like, share it with someone who loves a slow burn romance with teeth, and subscribe for more emotionally intense mafia romance stories every week. There's more darkness, more restraint, and more love that has to be earned still waiting.